Our next reader is Julie Rosenthal. She's a freelance writer in Chicago. She draws ideas for her stories from the encyclopedia articles she writes for Salem Press. Her fiction has been recognized by Chai Zine and has appeared in Columbia College's Chicago's 2011 Story Week Reader. More of her stories are forthcoming this year in Acapella Zoo, Kaleidotrope, and an anthology from India-based Zuban Books. Please welcome Julie Rosenthal.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to be reading two pieces tonight, both about couples and music and fighting. We'll start with the bad news. This is an excerpt from a short story called Trouble in Mind that's going to be appearing in a magazine called Acapella Zoo next month. And it's from the middle section, so I'll give you a little bit of background. Tony and Winnie are a married couple. They're in their 50s. They live in near future Hong Kong. Society has undergone a great change. People no longer communicate in words. This change is referred to in the story as conversion. Tony was left behind in this process, a situation that's left him a little bit like a stroke victim in the society, and his wife has been caring for him for the last few years. Tony stood in the kitchen doorway as he watched Winnie cook. Steam rose from a pot of boiling water on the two-burner stove, coiling into the curls of smoke rising from the tip of Tony's cigarette and lifting toward the low ceiling. The blade of the knife in Winnie's hand rocked back and forth on the wooden cutting board. Cloves of garlic were peeled with a single smack down to the creamy insides. Winnie always moved with an angry grace in the tiny apartment kitchen, but tonight she was working with unusual focus. Her glance never lifted from the cutting board or the stove. At last, Tony coughed. Winnie looked up. She touched a button on a screen on the wall next to her. From the stereo speakers above their heads, the ripple of a Bach prelude filled the kitchen. Winnie slid her finger along the screen to nudge the volume up. Tony's doctors had suggested that he immerse his brain in instrumental music, along with the drug therapy, in an effort to erase words and mimic the experience of conversion. The works of Bach, Mozart, and the 12-tone school of Schoenberg were recommended in daily doses. Winnie couldn't stand atonal music, so she had loaded the stereo with the classical composers. Tony had grown to hate them all, especially Bach. He edged around Winnie without touching her to reach the screen on the wall. Tony's hand slapped it into silence. Over the cutting board, the knife paused. Winnie's head turned. She pressed her lips together before she looked back down and resumed chopping. Tony's fingers wrapped the screen. A moment later, Dinah Washington was crooning at high volume through the steam and smoke of the kitchen. Sunshine through back doors and some sad old railroad iron. Tony crossed his arms and glared at his wife. Winnie grabbed a handful of green Bach choy leaves and flung them into a stainless steel strainer. Water shot from the faucet as she shook the strainer, sending a spray over the front of her silk sweater. She slammed off the faucet and dumped the wet leaves onto the cutting board. Her knife lifted. 2 strikes of the blade against the board. Then the knife clattered down on its side. Winnie was gripping her left hand. "Fuck," she whispered. A trickle of blood spidered down her fingers, then pulsed and flowed faster. Drops fell onto the cutting board as Winnie stared at her hand. Tony threw down his cigarette as he pulled Winnie toward the sink. She stood rigid as Tony rinsed her bleeding hand under cool water. He could feel her arm trembling under his as he examined the gash. It was crescent-shaped and bisected the back of two of Winnie's fingers just below the first knuckle. The water from the faucet flowed pale pink as it hit the sink's bottom. Tony was shaking too. It was the first time he had heard his wife say a word in 3 years. Tony wanted to turn to Winnie and grab her by the shoulders. Maybe if he could connect to that part of her, maybe there was a chance Tony could break through the hopeless sadness that filled Winnie's eyes whenever she came home and saw him, still helpless, still unable to think and communicate like everyone else. The urge to yell Winnie's name filled him until he could hardly breathe. Against his shoulder, Tony felt Winnie's head droop as her body sagged. The sight of blood had always made her faint. Tony turned off the faucet. He slipped one arm around Winnie as he reached for a dish towel to hold against the cut. He rubbed her back as she leaned against the kitchen sink. When Tony took her hand and pantomimed wrapping a bandage around it, his eyebrows lifted in a question, she nodded. A moment later, Tony was back in the kitchen with a box of first aid supplies. He dried Winnie's hand with the blood-stained dish towel. With one fingertip, he traced the lip of the cut with transparent adhesive gel that sealed the rest of the blood beneath Winnie's sliced open skin. Now all that could be seen were two dark red lines, like closed eyelids beneath a wet smear of clear jelly. Winnie's brown eyes had been fixed on a spot on the kitchen wall just above Tony's head as he worked. He released her hands and turned to wipe the rest of the gel from his fingers. From behind, Tony felt Winnie's arms curl around his waist. The warmth of her cheek rubbed against his shoulder. He stood still, holding his breath, waiting for Winnie to pull away. But her arms tightened as she pressed up against him. It had been a long time since Winnie had touched him with anything but pity. Tony could feel the weight of Winnie's slender body curving into his spine. He didn't need words. It wasn't sadness that was making her hold him now, but gratitude. And a stirring of something he had wondered if he would ever see or feel from her again. Desire. Inside her embrace, Tony turned to face Winnie. Her kiss was sweet and coy, the kind he hadn't tasted in years. Tony kissed her back. Winnie closed her eyes, smiled, and kissed him again, harder this time. For a moment, Tony wondered if there was another man. Then he didn't care. This next piece is called Upstairs. It's the one that appeared in Columbia's Story Week Reader this past spring. It's flash fiction, so it requires no introduction, really, and we all know these people. Set in modern Chicago. Upstairs. It was the scream we heard from upstairs every Friday night. We'd hear their TV turn off, footsteps to the bathroom, water running, footsteps from the bathroom. There would be 20 minutes, more or less, of silence. Then it would start. Low, velvet moans in a woman's voice, words, a name, Sam or San, or maybe a sigh, pleading in a slow rhythm that caught and quickened like a car engine turning over early on a January morning in Chicago. Then the squeal of a boiling kettle, wailing until someone clicked off the flame. On this Friday, the scream didn't stop. Think she's okay? I asked. Alex sat at the desk in the corner of the living room, grading papers. His back was turned to me. What? He said. On the couch, I was curled up inside a pink and green crocheted afghan. I watched Alex and waited silently for him to look over his shoulder. When he did, I pointed straight up. Alex glanced at the ceiling. Yeah? I said, I think she's okay. What do you mean? She always does that. Honey, I said, it's been an hour. Has it? Alex leaned back against the gray mesh of his desk chair, his fingers locked together above his knees. I put down my book, Stop Whining, Start Speaking, 10 Steps to a Successful Interview. We looked at each other. We looked at the ceiling. At breakfast, our neighbor's ecstatic squeal was starting to sag like a car alarm hooked to a dying battery. I wondered if she'd taken a breath yet. I knocked on the ceiling with a broom handle. There were a few seconds of silence, followed by laughter. Little shrieks, like glittering sparks from a Roman candle, darted up into the stratosphere. I called the super. Radiator, Hector said. No, I said, we hear it through the radiator. I come tomorrow. Over dinner that night, I told Alex. I waited for him to say, so we could say it together, Hector yesterday, Hector tomorrow, but never Hector today. Alex's fork scraped a white stripe through the tomato sauce coating his plate. He smashed a meatball flat against the tines. The metal handle clinked on the edge of the plate as he put the fork down. Maybe we should move, he said. Weeks went by. I started listening to opera, the way people begin drinking coffee, through a grimace, then with anticipation. Wagner first. The music was too big for an apartment as small and cramped as ours. It devoured the oxygen. But Das Rheingold sat on the screen, crushing it beneath its helmeted bulk, and gave me a few hours of relief. Mozart's Figaro, on the other hand, was airy enough to let the shriek through. I almost turned it off. I closed my eyes and saw Italian women in lace and low-cut bodices whispering behind feathered fans to men in white wigs about it, about her. Oh, true love, thou art forever, especially when one lives downstairs. A lady's no lady who screams night and day. Her paradise makes a hell of ours. Alex worked at home in the evenings, bent over his desk in the living room. He wore earplugs. I could see bits of orange foam peeking out of the canals of his ears. He started coming home later and later. I packed our suitcase for a weekend in Saugatuck. We drove through rain that slowed traffic on the interstate to a chain of wavering red brake lights, reflected off of the onyx black wet pavement. Raindrops rattled on the car windows. Static fuzzed the radio. In the driver's seat, Alex was smiling, his eyes on the road. We unlocked the door of the A-frame cabin and climbed the narrow wooden steps to the loft. Under a skylight was a king-size bed. Alex put our suitcase down. In the silence, we looked at each other. I'm getting a headache, I said. It's too quiet. I can't take this. No, Alex said. No way. His grin got wider. No headaches. He took a step toward me. My stomach tightened in a way it hadn't in a long, long time. I was laughing even before Alex started to tickle me. Soon my knees buckled. I folded. He caught me. Then neither of us was standing. By Sunday afternoon, I couldn't speak a word. Thank you.